Hello, everyone, and welcome to this book talk. Today, we are discussing the book Metastasis, The Rise of the Cancer Industrial Complex and the Horizons of Care. And we are actually very fortunate to have the author Nafis Hasan in attendance with us. I am Tayyaba Jiwani, and I am hosting this discussion today and hopefully asking Nafis some very tricky questions, which he's asked me to be soft on him, but it's not going to happen. So I'll do a quick round of introductions, and then we can get into a bit of a discussion of the book. And towards the end, we will turn to audience questions. So if you do have questions, just plug them along as you go, and we'll get to them at the end. Okay, so some quick introductions. I am Tayyaba. I am a cancer biologist in a past life. I did my PhD on the molecular biology of childhood brain cancers from the University of Toronto in Canada. And I now research the history and politics of modern genetics and based in the UK. And we have with us the excellent Nafis Hasan. Nafis received his PhD in cell molecular and developmental biology from Tufts. He is currently an associate faculty at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research and a labor organizer based in Philadelphia. Nafis is also an editor of the radical science magazine Science for the People and a proud member of the Democratic Socialists of America. And both Nafis and I are part of the editorial collective at Jamhoor, which is a South Asia-focused left media platform. So our many thank yous to this event's sponsors, Haymarket Books for organizing the event, Common Notions Press for publishing this book, and Science for the People, as well as Jamhoor for being amazing. And you can find the links to all of these organizations in the comments section if you want to learn more. So we'll move along swiftly to the book. So today we're here to talk about Metastasis, which is an excellent book that I've had the pleasure of reading recently. So I thought I would start off this conversation by giving, a quick kind of 7-minute-ish overview of the book and my thoughts on it. And then we can have Nafis share his response. And from there, we could then have a more interactive conversation and move to audience questions. Nafis, do you think that's reasonable?
Yeah, thanks, Tayyaba. That sounds great.
Okay, excellent. All right, so the way that I saw the book, and Nafis, feel free to step in and correct me if I'm horribly wrong, but Metastasis is a story of the cancer industrial complex, as you call it, the way that it has developed within the US after World War II, and particularly through neoliberalization of both science and society. And you trace that story very well in a kind of multi-layered way. The main argument that you're making is that cancer is a disease of capitalism. So not just in the way that cancer is as a disease, in the way that it's addicted to growth in an almost self-destructive way, but also in other ways. And there are kind of 3 major domains in which you are discussing the logic of neoliberalism intersecting with cancer. One of those domains is cancer research. The second is cancer healthcare. And third is the kind of social ecosystem around cancer. So to kind of briefly elaborate on what I mean by that, first, you're talking about cancer research in the way that it has been systematically transformed over the past few decades, in particular, to look at the genetic causes of cancer, as opposed to looking at cancer more in terms of a holistic analysis of genes and organisms and environment interacting together. So this has worked to shift the locus of disease to internal technical causes of disease rather than complex and biological and political causes. Second, you're talking about cancer medicine, and particularly in terms of drug development, the healthcare industry, and the larger ecosystem around that, for example, insurance, pharma companies, and so on, that are further working to individualize disease. So that is turning disease into more of a personal and biological problem, a problem of individual responsibility, a problem of personal responsibility of healthcare rather than a collective and political problem that society must confront. And lastly, you're talking about the systemic dimensions of cancer, the fact that we know that the biggest industries that are responsible for cancer under capitalism include the fossil fuel industry, weapons, plastics, petrochemicals, fertilizers, big agriculture. All of these industries are actually producing the very toxins that are resulting in cancer, but then are also responsible for generating the cures that we need. And there are other structural factors like class-based inequalities in healthcare and society, and global inequalities in politics and economy that are together structuring cancer as a political problem. And again, to come back to the earlier two domains, rather than us looking at this larger, wider systemic issue, we're focused on the genetic, the technical, the personal, which obscures this larger dimension of disease, but also prevents us coming up with real solutions. So I felt like the real value of the book is in showing how these different dynamics are interconnected through the logic of neoliberalism. So there are books that look at various different domains in isolation. What you've done is kind of connect these together under the larger story of neoliberalism and the cancer industrial complex. And how this has happened with the collaboration of the federal government and various governmental agencies, corporations, and nonprofits and universities, particularly in the US. And then I felt like this kind of frustrating, pessimistic analysis goes into a more optimistic territory when you talk about the larger horizon in terms of the fact that we cannot defeat cancer unless we talk about struggling against capitalism and defeating capitalism. And so you set out some ideas of political coalitions that we should be building to fight cancer as a political question. So I thought that that was an optimistic note to end the book on. And, of course, a very ambitious and a very kind of blue sky vision, but something that we could perhaps aspire to. So in other words, in kind of other thoughts as I read the book, I will just start off with some of my initial thoughts, and then we can, Nafis, you can step in and perhaps respond, and we can go into a conversation. So I came to the book as a scientist, as a cancer biologist, and I felt like, I was most drawn to your discussion on the limitations of our genetic theories of cancer, because I loved how you actually engage with the science on a scientific and a technical level to show that even at that technical level, it is not enough to grapple with the complexity of cancer, the biological complexity of cancer, or the physiological complexity of cancer, or indeed the sociological complexity of cancer. So I actually enjoyed how you go through the different history, the historical evolution of the theories of cancer origins to show how there were theories in the past that did look at the environmental dimensions of cancer, for example, but there was a concerted effort to kind of pivot away from those approaches to turn more internal, turn more molecular, and draw the field away from environmental and particularly occupational exposures that are resulting in cancer that were being pushed by labor unions or. So I like the fact that you engage with the science, and then I also like the fact that you extend that into medicine and take down this myth or illusion of precision medicine, which is the new buzzword. It's the ultimate dream of genetic science to be able to find the genetic causes of cancer and design a precise medical drug to act against them. So I like how you dissect that entire process and show why there is a kind of stagnation, not just in our scientific knowledge production, but also a stagnation in our drug development processes. So I felt that that alternative, that presents a good critique and an alternative point of view for scientists who may be critical or who may be questioning their work to kind of learn from your critiques. And so I felt that the natural audience of the book was these scientists, were scientists who were questioning, who were frustrating, and were struggling against the limits of their field to kind of lay those critiques out and kind of inspire them or try to radicalize them. So I want to kind of hear from you if that was indeed your intention, and if so, when you talk about the alternative theoretical approaches, I felt that there could have been a lot more detail that you went into for those alternative approaches to cancer for the scientists who are critiquing them. So maybe a good place for us to start is for you to talk about your intended audience and what were you trying to convey to them?
Wow. Yeah. Thanks so much for such a close reading of the book, Tayyaba. The way you summarized the whole book, like that's something maybe I was unable to do when I wrote the book. So it's really great how you put everything together. Yeah, I think part of it is that like when I was writing the book, I was asked like who my audience is going to be, and obviously this is a book for scientists who are frustrated with the current paradigms of scientific research, especially around cancer. But this is also a book for like people who have had a brush with cancer in their lives, and just by sheer statistics, right? Like all of us, like whether you or I or people on the call, or like watching this video has had some interaction or will have some interaction with cancer, whether it's through their own lives, through their relatives, through their friends, through a diagnosis, right, through financial hardship. So the goal was not necessarily restrict the book to like scientists, but to make it available to everybody who's interested in knowing um, this very simple question is that like we have been fighting this war against cancer for like 50 years, but why is it still why does it feel like we're still losing, right? Like why are we still losing our loved ones, our friends, our relatives, right? Like or even ourselves, right? Like why are we how have we not been able to extend the lives for the majority of cancer patients, right? Like yeah, sure, there's like some, like you mentioned, like there's some um, drugs that work really well, but most drugs don't work that well, right? So that's like a very simple question that a lot of have come up a lot of times, whether in my personal conversations or whether you look at reflections from like clinicians or personal narrative stories that people publish around cancer memoirs, right? um, so that was really the intention of when I wrote the book, is that yes, I want scientists, but also I want everybody else, right? And a big thing that I learned in graduate school was that um, when you write for scientists, it automatically kind of alienates the public or like the masses from accessing that material, which is one of the big obstacles that we have to overcome as scientists, or like as quote unquote former scientists ourselves, right? And how do we do that, right? And so part of the reason why I didn't, I mean, if I shared my previous drafts with you, then you probably see like I went into a lot more into the weeds about like biological theory, very specific instances of like where mutations are, not driving cancer, right? Like, or the mutations of like the what's called the somatic mutation theory, the hegemonic narrative that we all follow now, about how cancer is like, what causes cancer. So when I was trying to figure this out, and with the help of my editors, the goal was not necessarily to refute or point out every single inconsistency, but to create a narrative from the bottom up, right? And also provide an overarching detailed view of like, okay, so we have had this um, scientific paradigm under which we are working, is that mutations cause cancer, it's in our genes, right? But like the clinical data is showing otherwise, right? And there's this alternative theories that exist, like maybe it is time to think about something different, right? So and to without quoting Thomas Kuhn, right? I wanted to present that maybe we're on the precipice of like a scientific revolution, like as he would have described it, like science is going through a period of crisis, and there are parts of the book dedicated to like describing this crisis. Is like drugs that don't work, experiments that you cannot reproduce, right? Papers that are being retracted. So there's this like crisis biomedical science is going through, and I wanted to present that in a way that like people could generally approach it and understand that, look, it's not necessarily because the science is wrong, right? But it's just like we have relied too heavily on one particular theory and like kind of just accepted it as evident truth, right? And that's not how the scientific process works, right? Like as scientific training shows us, is that if you are scientific theories need to be testable, right? And they need to be able to be backed up by evidence. And if it's not working, then you kind of go back to the drawing board and see like what else can we, like what else needs to be done, right? But here's the tricky part, is that like science is not done in a vacuum, right? Which is which is to say that science is not apolitical, rather science is inherently political, because what we do in science, like, or what science we do, or what scientific theories we follow, are guided, or in some cases dictated, by political and social forces. And this is where I wanted to show that the shift away from environmental research towards the genetic research was not some, not some like, sorry, I'm trying to say, like, not some singular story that just happened, right? It's not a linear story that it just happened because, oh, in the 70s we were looking at chemicals or environmental toxins, then in the 80s suddenly we made a molecular biology breakthrough, and so everybody went to the genes, and then in 2000s we had the Human Genome Project, right? But these are not incidents, or these scientific discoveries are not in isolation, but rather they were under the influence of like the social and political forces, which namely are capitalism and neoliberalism. Like, that's what I try to show in the book, is that the direction or the flow of scientific research away from one idea to another is guided not just by scientific discoveries, but also through political forces, right? And I think that was what I was trying to get at. And so people, not just scientists, right, who are generally told that science is devoid of politics, right? And we can talk a little bit more about that later. But also people on the flip side who might be like, okay, so if science is doing so great, right, and we have put billions of dollars, it's a legitimate question to ask, like, why do we not have a cure, and why is that, right? Like, and I think that's where I try to strike a balance between like saying like, okay, there is some scientific theory here, like some scientific evidence that I'm providing and refuting, and this is the larger, this is the larger social political milieu within which this research is taking place.
Absolutely. And I think that narrative comes across really clearly, even though you're saying, as you said, not all the detail is important. I think the larger trends of that narrative do come across in the sense that you talk about how there was a deliberate way in which science was geneticized, how genetic explanations were favored over environmental or occupational, dimensions of science and so on. Especially there was this tension between the virus and, kind of viral approaches to cancer that were mobilized particularly to, at the expense of environmental and occupational exposures. But to stay on the theme of the gene, you have, as you said, science is inherently political, and the way that you approach the questions you ask are shaped by the assumptions that you go in with, and there will always be assumptions that you will go in with. And so one issue with the dominance or the hegemony of somatic mutation theory, or these kind of exclusively genetic approach to science, is the fact that this approach is in some ways the assumptions are implicit, they're not acknowledged, they're, that's just the kind of the standard domain in which we're operating. So the way that we design our experiments, the way that we approach our science is with these assumptions that cancer is genetic, but that's not necessarily stated. And alternative frameworks or assumptions are not necessarily even taught, or most scientists would not be aware of them. So given that you have a very particular understanding of this, and you come from this background where you have explored these alternative biological and theoretical frameworks, what for you would be a good model through which to approach cancer? One, would you say that we forget about the gene? Would you say, how would you approach a theory of cancer?
Yeah, so the first thing is it's difficult because I would push back a little bit, saying that the assumptions are not always implicit. They're actually very explicit. If you read any biology textbook, right, like the cancer biology textbook by Robert Weinberg, or even the molecular biology of the cell by Bruce Alberts, which are like canons of the field, right? And the first thing they would say, like, cancer is a genetic disease, and that's pretty much plastered everywhere you look. So I don't think it's like a very implicit thing. It's like a very explicitly being it's being reinforced, right? The second thing I would say is, like, we sort of have to break away from, and here's the part where the assumption is implicit, is that, like, we have to break out of this mold, or this thinking is that a cancer is caused by a single gene, or let's say now there's like a whole number of genes that are called, like, oncogenes, right? Like, and or tumor suppressor genes that are mutated and cause cancer, right? So that one-to-one binary of genotype to phenotype needs to be abolished. And I think part of it, we are already there, right? Like, now people talk about, like, okay, there are genes that are interacting together, but even then, I think the problem is that we are assuming that cancer is a cellular disease, and the reason why I say that is because the narrative is um, a mutation in a gene within a single cell makes that cell go rogue, and then the cell starts multiplying without any sort of checks and balances, or like out of control, right? And that's what's causing the tumor to form and the cancer to spread, et cetera, right? But when you look at the clinic, right, like the disease is categorized and classified and detected and diagnosed at the tissue level, right? So for folks who may not be familiar, the tissue is essentially a group of cells, right? Like, and these group of cells have like very particular functions, and the tissue can be divided into like two different parts, which is like the epithelial part, and then the stromal part. The epithelial part is responsible for the tissue's function. For example, if it's let's say, the pancreas, then the epithelial pancreatic cells are producing the hormones, insulin. And then there's the stromal cells, which for the longest time has been described as the supportive cells that holds the tissue together, right? So when you look at a tumor, you're essentially looking at the tissue architecture overall to classify and diagnose the cancer. And there is no evidence, there's no recorded evidence of a cancer originating from a single cell as of yet, right? It always happens in like a field or a group of cells. Um, and people have tried doing that using like lineage tracing, but it always turns out that there is, like a group of cells that it's affecting, right? There's no single cancer cell. And I think I write about this is like, does the cancer cell even exist, right? Like what is a cancer cell in the meantime? Because the flip side to all of this is that you take a cancer cell and if you put it in like an environment, in a normal environment, like a non-cancerous environment, and in a lot of cases, you will see that this cell acts like a normal cell, like it's not replicating out of control, it's normalized, and these are called like normalization experiments. They have been done for decades. And they are able to give rise to proper structures, right? Like, for example, mammary tumor cells when embedded in a normal mammary stroma, and here I'm using technical terms, but like for people, it'd be like within breast tissue, right? You put it in a normal context, they'll form like the ducts, right? But these are quote unquote cancer cells, right? So my training comes from like my training comes from a background of developmental biology, where it is also interesting because you will see that a lot of the genes that are quote unquote called oncogenes are also the genes that are expressed during development for normal development, right? And that's the question is like, but this gene expression is heavily dependent on the context, right? They're not necessarily turning off and on by themselves. They are depending on the environmental cues, the crosstalk between the cells themselves to be turned on and off. And I think that's where even in the 19th century, German pathologists had sort of talked about this idea that like maybe cancer is not a cellular disease, it's a disease of the tissue, right? It's an entire tissue that's being affected. And so I think even if we talk about like, okay, so we know a lot about these genes, right? Like how were they playing things out? You sort of still have to understand that cancer is not to be studied in the cell, but you have to look at it at the tissue level of biological organization. And that's where I'm coming from. And that background has led to this idea, this alternative theory called the tissue organization field theory, which says that cancer originates because the crosstalk between the stromal and the epithelial compartments of a tissue are disrupted, right? So basically, there's something going on where like we are unable, like the cells are unable to like talk to each other, or they're like counterparts in the environment, right? And that's my training, and that's where I'm coming from. And I'm that's the evidence I've provided in the book. There's some seminal experiments that were done, and really this was done, a couple of them were done in my graduate lab. Like my mentors, Anna Soto and Carlos Sonnenschein, they're the ones who did these experiments, and they're the ones who proposed this theory. But overarchingly, this theory is not just coming from one or two like observations, right? There is like a bigger thing at play, which is and here's the interesting part: the somatic mutation theory relies on a couple of very specific assumptions. Like one of them is that cells in the human body, or like larger mammals, or like what we would call metazoans, right? Like, to use the technical term, they are quiescent. That means they don't do anything unless they're just like hanging out or resting, right? So, but that's not true, right? First rule of like, evolutionarily, cells are not quiescent. Like every single other cell sort of, is replicating, they're moving, they're differentiating, they're like kind of doing their thing together or individually. But suddenly we are now saying like, no, 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 just in the human body or like in the mammals or like organisms that get cancer, these cells are quiescent, right? Which is like a very big, should raise a lot of eyebrows. Like, okay, what happened there, evolution, right? Like, why did we stop doing that? The second thing it relies on is that, sorry. So the second thing it relies on is that, that cancer is a disease of mutations, right? So, and we covered the topic of mutation already, but on the flip side, the tissue organization field theory assumes that cells are proliferating and, they're motile, right? Like they're moving around and proliferating, right? So if you look at it in from the Toft angle, right, which is the acronym for tissue organization field theory, then cancer cells are non-existent. It's just the cells that were under constraint from proliferating and moving around, right? They were put under constraints, and those constraints go away because there's a disruption in the crosstalk, and that's when you start seeing like proliferation. So the cells are doing what they should be, except that the constraints that were put upon them were removed by some sort of like, whether it's an environmental insult, whether it's like radiation, et cetera, right? So I think that's where I'm coming from.
Mhm.
And obviously, like there's some evidence that I provide for that, like for example, how do endocrine disrupting chemicals which act like hormones in the body give rise to cancers. That's a really good explanation. And there's also a lot of like, um, flaws of the SMT. Like SMT is unable to explain there are certain tumors that do not have any mutations, right? Like, so
Mhm.
how are they forming, right? Why, for example, the most commonly known endocrine disrupting chemical BPA or bisphenol A, which is one of the most highest volume chemical product produced in the worldwide and is present in like 96% of the US population. How does that give rise to cancers, even though it doesn't cause mutations, right? So there are some very basic questions that the SMT is unable to provide answers to. And I think this is where the alternative theory Toft is able to provide a more coherent perspective or a more coherent theory of carcinogenesis.
No, absolutely. I think the way the SMT approaches cancer is kind of almost like the great man theory of history, where there's one gene that goes wrong that becomes creates a cell that is the great cell that will cause cancer, and then
Yeah.
that cell just takes on the body, then takes on all the cells in the rest of the body to launch a fight and then result in cancer somehow. And all we have to do is find that one cell, and we will get rid of all the problems. And so which again, if you consider disease, it is always a more organ level, tissue level, system level phenomenon um, which we need to address. So okay, we're going to move on from our nerding out on cancer to larger questions that people might be more interested in. So at one point, or well, at many points in the book, you've said that we are losing the war on cancer, right? And if I was to play devil's advocate, point to the fact that we've actually improved survival. We've improved survival for a lot of cancers. Breast cancer, skin cancer are not the kind of death sentence that they used to be in many cases now, at least in the developed world. And in general, survival has improved in the last 50 years. So why do you say that we are losing the war on cancer?
That's a really good question. And maybe this is the part where I say some very controversial things, right? Like,
Okay.
but honestly, okay. So has cancer mortality gone down? I think that's a decent question to ask. I think yes, but also it's sort of like flatlining. And here's the thing is that the majority or the biggest reduction in cancer related mortality we have gotten is from public health. And one of the biggest ones is like the anti-smoking campaigns that happen in the US, right? The benefit from chemotherapy, right, is much lower compared to like what you see from screening or even or like anti-smoking campaigns or like other public health programs. And I think there was a recent study published like a couple of months ago where they looked at decades of like screening and prevention work and saw that that's really what's contributing to the fall in cancer mortality, right? But that's not where the money is though, right? Like you look at the budget for the National Cancer Institute, majority of the money is going towards developing newer drugs, and we can talk about why that is. But like to come back to your question, I would say primarily the cancer deaths are from metastasis, and people are not dying from, besides like a few types of cancer, people are not dying from the primary tumors anymore, because now, thanks to awareness campaigns, you are able to like go into the doctor's office, and if there is a tumor that you have, they are surgically able to remove it or like treat it with some form of chemotherapy, but inevitably it comes back and it spreads, right? So then it becomes the question of like, okay, so how are we saying that the survival rates have gone up? And this is where detection is a big thing, right? And early detection saves lives has been a mantra in cancer research for a long time, even before Susan Komen took it up, right, from the 1930s, where I show that the Women's Field Army, which was like a group of women raising awareness about cancer. They also talked about early detection. So it has really always been the idea that if you catch it early enough, then you should be able to treat it and get rid of it and be cured, right? But that's not always happening, because on the flip side, a lot of the times you're catching uh, cancers or tumors that may not have been cancerous, right? You are looking at what's called, precancerous lesions, which are not cancerous, but which could be, but you're preemptively taking it up and saying like, okay, I'm going to get rid of it. It's like, for example, a mole, or like you find what's called in the breast, like ductal carcinoma in situ, stage 0. So if you find a DCIS, you can say like, oh, I had cancer and I am cured. So, we must be doing something right. And this is not to say that this is not to downplay the effects of screening or awareness campaigns, but I do think we should be a little bit more critical of data that says outright that yeah, we are winning the war on cancer because look at all these like cancer patients we saved, right? But again, here's what is tricky: is that socially we have constructed this narrative is that if we are catching cancers early enough, then we are treating them, then we are winning the war, right? But you look at the large swaths of people who have later stage cancers, like even from like let's say stage 2 and above, what is the survival rate for them, right? Like not and maybe yeah, there are some cancers which we're really good at treating. It's like, for example, childhood leukemia. Some of those leukemias, we have one drug that works really well, but then it's similar drugs don't work as well. So like then the question should not be like, oh, we're winning. The question is like, okay, well, why don't these other drugs work? What about these other kinds of leukemias? What are we doing about them, right? So in some way, there's like a confluence of things that are happening. One of them is we are overly, because of like early detection saves lives mantra, we are going in and getting diagnosed, right? There's this like diagnosis thing, and you will see like reports of like overdiagnosed people. Like there's like cases of overdiagnosis in thyroid cancers, in prostate cancers, in breast cancers, right? And in some cases, because of overdiagnosis, the public health agencies have sort of changed their screening policies, right? So you used to be able to get a mammogram after above the age of 40, a woman would be said to get a mammogram every year, but now it's every 2 years, right? Because it really didn't save as many lives as they thought it would, like getting it every year, right? So we have to be a little critical about like say presenting the idea that, oh, we're just winning the war on cancer because we are able to catch cancers at a much earlier stage when they're not even cancers, right? So like, but we're gonna include those as well, just like beef up our numbers, right? Yeah, so I think that's like something that needs to be looked at more critically. The other thing that I talk about in the book is that what does it mean to die from cancer, right? Like maybe you're not dying from the disease, but like there's something called financial toxicity that's very much associated with cancer research, especially in the United States, where you don't have universal healthcare, right? And you are basically either you're going to die of the disease, or you're gonna die from paying for the treatment for the disease, which is like a really
That's a
bleak
US
thing to even
problem.
think about. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I think it's a
Maybe, yeah.
larger like
Yeah,
capitalism problem,
for
because
sure.
I think in the UK where you're located, right, the NHS is being privatized, and I think we're probably
Absolutely.
going to see something like that, or even like a mixed model issue, like in Canada,
Mhm.
right? Like the healthcare is not fully universal, right?
Mhm.
So the public-private partnerships makes it harder for people to see specialists and stuff, right? So I think we can talk about the quirks of healthcare, but I think when we talk about like, okay, people dying from cancer, is it just really the disease, or like what does it mean, right? Like, are people, sure, you may not, your cancer may not come back in 5 years, but in those 5 years your quality of life goes down so bad that you might still pass away, right? So like that's something to consider, is that would you consider that a cancer related mortality or not?
No, absolutely. I think, yeah, I agree with you. And I think one of the other factors that I've thought about a lot is that, on the one hand, we've had a lot of this triumphalism. A lot of the big kind of cancer organized advocacy organizations really like trumpet our successes against, in terms of improving survival, in terms of catching breast cancer early, in terms of developing new therapies for breast cancer, which in some cases work. Like for all our, and I agree with you about the limitations of genetics and so on, but there are some things that we have been able to do through BRCA mutations and so on that are helpful. But um, the fact remains that cancer, in terms of the total overall burden, is rising. We're not able to reduce the cases of cancer. And a lot of that, often gets chalked up to age. Because the standard line is that there are more cancers because we're living longer. But actually, that is not true, because increasingly, data is showing that cancer is occurring at younger and younger ages. So actually, there is a huge problem worldwide in terms of colorectal cancers becoming more common in people under 50, when those rates were very small, even 20, 30 years ago. So colorectal cancers across the world are rising to a huge extent. And so cancers are happening younger, so you can't really explain it by age. On the other hand, the successes that we still have, that we've had recently, in the last 50 years, for example, as you said, have been down to, a lot of public health campaigns like tobacco control, and, being able to screen people with smoking histories for lung cancer and being able to catch it early, for example. So that kind of thing. Asbestos control has been a huge improver in that context as well. So yes, a lot of public health campaigns have actually yielded more impact, more improvements than a lot of the drugs that we've been able to design. But I think on this point of tobacco, I wanted to touch back on this kind of like this new mantra of, cancer control as being, the only context in which environmental exposures or environmental factors as being causes of cancer, the only context in which that is recognized is usually in the context of tobacco or obesity or diet or alcohol. Again, all four very lifestyle, they're called lifestyle choices. They're called behavioral issues, which again, rather than looking at these kind of environmental exposures or larger societal causes of cancer in a political way, again, that is boiled down to an individual problem. So while the discourse on tobacco is in some ways, it's good, it's helpful, I also find that overemphasis on that becomes very unhelpful.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, look, it's like there was only a very brief period of time in the U.S. history, and obviously my book has focuses a lot on U.S. history, because that's what I, in my research, that's what I really focused on. And also, the United States definitely is where the most naked expression of capitalism and its ills and its relations to cancer is the most evident, right? But there was a very brief period in which cancer was not an individual's problem. And so,
Mhm.
and I write about this a little bit in the book, is that in the 1930s and 40s, right, like when there was initial waves of activism, it came from conservative white women who were housewives, right, like middle class, and it generally, cancer activism had a very sort of like conservative bent to it, right? And only in the 50s to the 70s we're starting to see like it changing. Like it's not just an individual issue, it's also like an occupational and environmental exposure issue. But just like many of the current ills of our society, and at least in the US, can be traced back to Reagan and his policies, I think like the return of individualization and reinforcement of it through neoliberal ideas, it does go back to Reagan. And because the reason I say that is during Reagan's term, this was like right following the 70s, where even under Republican government and administration, there were like huge environmental wins thanks to like labor organizations, labor unions, environmental organizations. That was like the heyday of like big labor and big, the labor and the green compact, right? And now it's like the people think about like how do we bring that back, right? Because that's for obviously to fight the climate crisis. But now under Reagan, what happened was there was a very big shift, uh, like a cultural shift, where a lot of the problems were just pushed onto the individual and said like, no, it's your problem. You didn't do this, right? You didn't eat well. You didn't live your life well. You smoked too many cigarettes, right? Like you lived near a fossil fuel industry, like which is kind of wild when you think about like how red zoning works, and it's a systemic issue. But there was like a cultural shift because there were all these like right-wing writers who were coming out of the woodwork and saying stuff like, oh, these environmentalists are blowing things out of proportion. Chemicals are a price it's a small price to pay for like progress, technological progress, etc. And even Bruce Ames, right, who is a very famous cancer researcher, really famous for establishing what's called the Ames assay, has a NASA center named after him. And he was originally like a pro what's called the environmentalist thesis. Is like that's what that's the thesis that says that environmental pollution is like is the cause of cancer, right? And he was a proponent of it. But then in the 80s, suddenly he's like, yeah, I don't think I believe that anymore. And suddenly he was saying stuff like he was supporting this lifestyle stuff, and he's saying these outlandish things like, yeah, eating too much spinach will give you cancer, right? Like, and it's kind of a weird shift. But then like how do you make sense of it is in his personal correspondence with the cancer historian Robert Proctor, who actually writes about it. Robert Proctor is saying that he reached out to Ames, and Ames is basically saying, yeah, I think like I became a libertarian, and I think that's what influenced my understanding of like what causes cancer, and it's really the individual's issue, right? um Concurrently, what we're seeing is the rise in the genetic aspect. The molecular, the DNA structure was discovered in the 50s, thanks to Rosalind Franklin and the two dudes. And then in a a series of political maneuvers that I don't want to get into too much right now, and it's in the book, but like Watson sort of mobilizes a lot of this cancer money towards molecular biology away from the virus research, right? And he's saying now that like, okay, it did a lot of that money that went into viral cancer research is being subverted or like flowing towards molecular biology research, and the infrastructure is same. They're using that infrastructure, and that's how Robert Weinberg discovers a SART gene in human tumors, and then suddenly it's all like, okay, it's in the genes, guys, we found it, right? And now we are here. It's been like what, 50 years, more than 50 years, and we're still digging that theory. And on top of that, the Human Genome Project kind of gave another boost to this individualization of the cancer theory, or like individualization of cancer as a disease. Is that when we think about the Human Genome Project, how it was framed is that the human genome, the genome is the book of life, right? And so every person's book of life is within them, and once we read it, we should be able to cure their disease, right? And I think that's what it was sold as. And so it further reinforced the idea that cancer must be a genetic and therefore an individual's disease, right? And socially and politically, what's been happening is the fraying of the social security net, or the the deregulation, right? Like, or like uh the regulations that were passed, that they were being defanged, right? And so in a way, we sort of like gave up on this idea that, hey, maybe we could make society a little better so that we don't get cancer, and to shifting away from that and saying like, oh, you got cancer, too bad, now you gotta like fix it yourself, right? um Another whole theater that happened was how cancer became like a major social phenomenon, and that's thanks to like Mary Lasker, right, and
Mhm.
her advocacy for increased federal funding for research. But what she wanted was not money for prevention; she wanted money for cures, right? And that's what the historian Robin Wolf Scheffler writes about as the biomedical settlement, is that we sort of like gave up on this idea that hey, we can prevent diseases, and just straight headlong went into like, can we cure them once they happen? Because in some ways that kind of removes the culpability of people, of like the entities that are creating chemicals that cause cancer. And it's like, it sounds like a bad joke, but like the ones who are creating these chemicals are also the ones creating those drugs. Like Novartis in its previous iteration as Sibagigi, right, was dumping chemical carcinogens in the environment, and now Novartis is one of the biggest producers of anti-cancer drugs, right? Like, so it's sort of like it's really bleak, like when you think about it, right? So socially and scientifically, they sort of merge into this idea that okay, cancer is an individual's disease, and if we just put enough money into like finding a cure, we should be able to cure it, right? Rather than as a society trying to like change things around to prevent it.
Yeah, no, exactly. And while you were tracing that history, I actually had a thought of there's a story that can be told about how um, there was a similar resurgence of race and IQ genetics in the 90s as well. And, again, very kind of in opposition to this kind of radical race politics and radical science movement and its takes on race in the 60s and 70s, and how then there was a resurgence of libertarian thinking and eugenicist kind of arguments that said that race and IQ are also encoded in the genome around the same time. So there is an interesting story to be told there.
Yeah, the bell curve, right? By
Bell
Tony.
curve, exactly.
Yeah, I do want to say that the SMT, even before it was the somatic mutation theory, the idea that cancer is caused by genes, it does have its like underpinnings in eugenics. And
Mhm.
one of the like one of the big examples is like the researcher who invented the Pap smear presented it at like a conference called like the Race Betterment Conference back in like the 19, I think it was like either the late 20s or early 30s. Yeah, but it has been around for a long time, and in some ways, the SMT is maybe a soft, a soft endorsement of eugenic and genetic deterministic thinking.
Mhm. Yeah, excellent. Well, I did have a question in my mind, which I now have forgotten. But let's move to another question. I think when you talk about let's move kind of away from the science in the last bit that we have, and talk more about scientists. So one thing that you talk about, well, you talk about reaching out to scientists in addition to other people, but you mentioned also there's a significant chunk of the book you spend on talking about neoliberalism in academia and how that is warping the way science gets done. There is a replication crisis in terms of papers that are published cannot be repeated by other scientists when they do those experiments independently, or there's a retraction crisis where published papers are being retracted because the data turn out to be fraudulent or poorly controlled or whatever, and similar issues in the scientific enterprise. So no pun intended. So if you have this kind of neoliberal crisis in the university, and you kind of you talk about it in the sense that you ask scientists to that's part of the struggle that they should be waging, right? They should be waging a struggle for reforming science is one of the arguments that you make, if I remember correctly. And I'm wondering if you can talk more about the role of scientists themselves in allowing this neoliberalization, because it didn't just happen as if while they were kind of passive, right? Scientists
Yeah,
have overall benefited from neoliberalism,
yeah.
because it has allowed the commercialization of science. It has allowed the ability to create spin-offs and startups that allow millions of private capital to flow in, and every scientist becomes an entrepreneur, as you've also said. So there's this promise. Obviously, not every scientist becomes an entrepreneur, but there's a promise, and this in the larger kind of capitalist realism background, it's easier to embrace this kind of science with the promise of riches. So where do you hold scientists accountable in that kind of landscape? And then do you think that demanding a bit more radicalism from them is perhaps wishful thinking?
Wow, yeah, that's a big question, and there's um I think the problem is, it's not a problem. I think it's like the capitalist realism thing is like we all live in a society, right? And we all gotta like, and in the US especially, where when your health insurance is tied to your work for the most part, it is really hard to like not work within the system, right? So, but I do think there's I do think there are lessons we need to learn from history, right? And there's a there's a really good quote that I use from a journalist writing in the Science magazine, is that and maybe I'm gonna end up misquoting it because I don't remember every sentence, but it's something along the lines of, the private public collaboration is inevitably going to end up in tears for scientists, right? And this is what's really happening. And I do want to make a distinction here, is like scientist is like a huge catch-all term, right? And so we sort of have to understand who are the scientists that we're talking about, who are the scientists that I am talking to, who are the scientists I want to see radicalized, right? And it's not the not the Albert Bourlas of the world, who are the CEOs of like the big pharma companies. I'm talking about the struggling scientists. I'm talking about the early career researchers. I'm talking about the postdocs, the grad students, right? Like, or even the adjunct faculty, right? Like people who are fighting for tenure or like a stable job at the very least, right? I'm even talking about the people who, for lack of other opportunities or um, lack of radicalization, are stuck doing mind-numbing work. Because what has happened is the scientific research has been transformed fundamentally under capitalism from like you'd consider like a craft, right? Like from the days of old, where you work with somebody and you learn the craft, right? You become a craftsman. And that's still the ideal model that we think we're doing, but that's not what we're doing really in the lab, are we? Like, yeah, sure, we're going through a PhD program with a mentor. Um, and then, we are talking about like, okay, so what does it mean to be a mentee, etc.? We're still trying to use this model in a very much Fordist assembly line situation, where we're talking about efficiency of producing PhDs, or how do we market a PhD as a critical skill. Basically, the scientists are the proletariat now, right? And there is like a big class difference. And I think like there has to be some kind of reckoning of like, where are scientists today, as what is their class position in society? And I try to answer that question through like some previous predecessors have done in Science for the People magazine. Andre Gores has like a good discussion around it. And it's sort of like trying to figure out like, okay, what is our role? But I think fundamentally also we sort of need to move away from the idea that scientists are like a whole different identity, right? Like I don't think that model is going to work anymore, because here's the problem, is that identity has allowed alienation from the rest of society, which we are seeing now, right? Like, which clearly there is a huge mistrust of scientists that's happening in the US. I mean, there's rising vaccine or like science skepticism across the world, right? Like people are not really like buying stuff, but like it's not a science problem, it's a political problem, right? Like, because we have alienated ourselves, and to use like some lofty words, like, we have sort of put ourselves in the ivory tower and locked ourselves in and just asked people to implicitly believe us, when why should they? Like, you're you're another human being. Yeah, sure, like we can talk about PhDs and expertise and blah blah blah, but like fundamentally you're still a member of the society as much as they are, right? And I think this we have to reimagine what a scientist is, eh, because we're living within the society, right? And I think and to that end, this Christopher Caldwell, who was like a British Marxist, wrote something like, a scientist is like, has to come from the people, right? Like they're a person, a member of society first, and then they're a scientist. Like it's a work identity that you were doing, right? It's work at the end of the day, right? So you cannot see yourself separate from society. So you have to also, and if that's the case, if you are a member of society and you are working as a scientist, then you also need to think about like, who is your science for, right? Like how is it going to serve society at large, and like, who is it for, right? Because a lot of majority of grad students go into research to this like, or like a better term, like soul crushing, grind, because they believe in something larger, like in a larger goal, a larger purpose, right? But but at the end of the day, when they come out on the other side, like, are they doing that purpose? Like, are they still going home and saying, like, I worked 60 hours this week, and because towards this larger goal that I'm going to be able to help a bunch of people? Because when you look at the prices of cancer drugs, I don't think that's where we're ending up. I'm sorry. Like, if a drug is like inaccessible to large swaths of the population, I don't think we're meeting that larger purpose, right? Um, so I think, like, is there hope for radicalization? I think so, because more and more, and this is where heightening contradictions, to borrow some Marxist phrases here, is important, because more and more scientists, especially the ones in the lower rungs of the ladder, are being squeezed really hard by like increasingly neoliberal universities that act as more like hedge funds rather than institutions, right? So they are squeezing their workforce, as is true for any corporation, and the proletarian scientists are fighting back. And I think you see this in like grad student unionization, you see adjunct faculty unionizing, you see postdocs unionizing, all of this because they want to be treated as workers and not just like some ideal that, oh, once I was a trainee to become a craftsman. No, that's also like some way of alienation, because ultimately you're not going to come to some, you by yourself is not going to come to some like grand realization that, like, oh, I need to do something good for the people. It's going to be have to be something like you learn through the struggle with others, right? You learn your fellow grad students who may not be coming from the same background as you are, but like through your union, right? Like you can talk to them and be like, what brought you here? How are you, like, what was your life, right? Like, and I think that's important, because um like an insidious aspect of capitalism is also to alienate us from each other, right? And I think that's something that scientists should like realize, is that, you know there's no glory in like following that dream of like being an alienated white coat slaving away in labs. That sort of like mentality, it only feeds your own misery, right? Like, you should be out there working with your coworkers together. Like, you need to cultivate that collective idea that we are all in this together, because otherwise how are you going to apply that same logic to the work you do, you know?
Yeah, and building on that, I think in my experience, one reason the scientists have been very reluctant to talk about political issues is this kind of naive clinging to the idea that science is apolitical, right? Like, by entering political conversations, we are almost like undermining our own credentials, undermining our own ability to be unbiased, whatever that means. And so that has been one of the kind of, at least I'm speaking from a more Canadian context, that has been one of the reasons why it has been difficult to get a hold of scientists and even organize them to take part in strikes and, graduate student organizing and so on and so forth. But I think if we look at recent events, I think uh, one being the kind of exposing of this kind of academic industrial complex with the war in Palestine, and how there is increased, the links between global capital, weapons, war industry, pharma, and academic research are now, it's not a matter of debate anymore. But also, and more kind of in your face, has been the kind of lining up of the tech oligarchy, along with right-wing interests and Donald Trump, right? So, do you think, is that, those, in my view, those two events kind of already make it very clear that science is nothing but political, right? And so forces you to have this kind of reckoning. So have you seen that in the recent mobilizations that have come up against Trump, the March for Science and so on?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And and I think well, actually, I would say, like, I see that there's an audience question, so that's got
There
a
is an audience.
similar vibe that I'm gonna try and roll it in, if that's okay. Like, somebody
Yeah,
asked about the political co-optation of my work for current anti-science fascist turn, feeding RFK, etc. Right? So what I would say is, like, science was intentionally scrubbed of politics as an anti-communist imperative, right? Like, this was in the 70s. There was a surge of like Marxist science, and there were radical scientists, like people who belong to the, or like, initial Science for the People magazine and the organization who established it. And they had a very political analysis of science, and that was very useful to understand like how, we how to do a science that serves the people, right? And not just our own self-interest. But in the Cold War, the American science enterprise sort of like reshaped itself into something like, oh, we believe in free thinking, and we believe in academic freedom or like intellectual freedom, and so we reject the Soviet Marxist science, and we are science that has no politics, right? And so fast forward to today, I think if you look at the trends in mobilization around scientific issues, right? Like the fact that we have trumpeted the idea that science is without politics, or like science is apolitical, is one of the is a big reason why there is so much distrust or skepticism of scientific research right now. Because on the one hand, you have these scientist entrepreneurs, right, who have made a lot of money during the pandemic or even before that, right? And for good reason, people are skeptical of that. It's like, okay, well, I mean, look, there's like right wing and left wing critique of big pharma, right? On the right wing, the big pharma critique is like they sold us some bullshit medicine and got rich, and now the cure to that is like seed oil or like some snake oil that somebody's selling. But on the left wing, it's like, yes, they did do that. Science is distorted under capitalism. Big pharma made a lot of money, but like the point is not to like go back to seed oils. The point is like, how do we take control of the scientific process ourselves? And I think that's important, and we need to advance that sort of critique and not just cede the ground to right wing people, because, and I think that's where they made a lot of progress, right? Like the return of vaccine skepticism or hesitancy, and the concurrent and consequently the return of measles is terrifying, right? Like, but that's also because like the left kind of gave up on that sort of fight, right? The left didn't come back and they're like, no, science is inherently political and we need to fight for this and we need to be able to make it a democratic process. Instead, they were just like, we're just gonna trust what the institutions say, and the institutions that are like, they are acting like hedge funds. So like, why would the masses believe people who are like squeezing them, right? So I think there that part is definitely there. There's also the part about how. Sorry, I'm just. I think I got a little bit derailed. Can you, Tayyaba, can you like ask me like the question that you had asked originally, like about like what you wanted to know about like
Yeah, no, the
oh, the
question.
March for Science. Yes, no,
Yes.
sorry, I got it. Okay, yeah. Okay, so I was involved in the March for Science in 2017, right?
Mhm.
And also in the 2018. And the big difference I saw is that 2017, there were like millions of people out on the streets, like hundreds of cities across the globe. This was like the big deal. And I was like very hopeful. I was like, yeah, this is what's going to turn the tide into like making science a political matter, right? People are going to understand that this is a matter of politics. Like this is not just not bipartisanship, not like Democrats versus Republicans, but this is an inherently political process. But what happened was, when Congress was able to pass an appropriations budget that actually had more funding for NIH and NCI, right? But they did make cuts. So Trump's first presidency, he made cuts to the EPA, he made cuts to like some of the other government agents, like NIHS, like the environmental stuff, right? But like once the NIH and the NCI budget were doubled, the scientists were kind of just like, oh, we're good, like guys, let's get back to the labs, right? And so in 2018, the turnout was so drastically lower. It was kind of very like mind-boggling to see like how much people just like kind of gave up. And like one of my a fellow cohort member in my grad school basically told me like, oh, the March for Science is only about like climate stuff. It's got like nothing to do with us. And it was like very eye-opening, because it was like, oh no, we are like still stuck there. And so I think sort of that repeat is happening. Do see, yes, there's mobilization this time around for like Stand Up for Science, right? Like that rally happened. But I am cynical about this, because when you go to the Stand Up for Science website, the first thing they say is like, science must be free of politics. And I'm like, no, this is the same mistake we're making again, right? Like what does it mean to be like free of politics? Like I don't if you are asking the government to fund your science, like how do you think that happens? It's an inherently political process. Like, so why should you just say like, oh, it should be devoid of politics? It doesn't compute for me. And the way the politics has been done, and I will say this example is that, um, the March for Science basically became a super PAC called like 314 Action, right? It borrowed its name from PIDE, etc. And they basically encourage scientists to run for office everywhere. Like, it's like, okay, great. Like, scientists are going to run for office. So once we have scientists in like these elected positions, we will be able to secure our livelihoods through funding, etc., and like bring trust back, etc. Right? It didn't really go very well, right? So not a lot of people are elected, and I understand, the vagaries of like electoral politics, how difficult it is sometimes. I have tasted my share of defeat as being part of DSA, but in some ways, like they elected some people, but where are the scientists now? One of the most prominent science advocates was Mark Kelly from Arizona. He's a Democratic senator, but his voting record is pretty, like, he's one of the more pro-Trump voters in the Senate, right? So like, how are you saying like you are a pro-science person but voting in the same way as an anti-science president's policies, right? Like, how does that? And this is the end point of when you say science is not political. This is what we end up with. So no, I think, but on the flip side, you do have the labor unions, like the grad students, the postdoc unions, even the government employees now, right, who are out on the streets, who understand that the science that they do is not separate from politics. It is within the influence of politics. And so they're exerting their power to get what they can out of this, right? So, and I think those are the two contrasting pictures I'll present to say, like, okay, there are two ways of thinking about like how do you mobilize to get more funding for science, to restore trust in science, and I would certainly prefer the one that the labor unions are doing. And I will also point out these unions are in the front lines. They're the front line for cuts to like the NIH or the funding freezes, right? It's not the universities. The universities are equating even before the cuts are coming, right? They are just like freezing their assets. Like, they have millions of dollars in endowment, but they're just like giving up. They're giving this, we'll just call anticipatory obedience, right? So I'm not trusting the universities to do anything, or even like tenured faculty who have like private interests. And I wrote a piece about this on the Progressive about like how this class distinction is which is very key to understanding how the resistance is playing out and how it played out in 2017 versus like now, right? But yeah, and I will say that we cannot cede ground in the fear that the right wing will co-opt our critique, because we also have to be able to present an alternative, right? And I think that's what I tried to do in the book. Like, yeah, sure, there's a lot of pessimistic stuff, right? But like, in the optimism is within these collective actions, right? And I think, yeah, that's where I will leave it.
No, I totally agree. And to underscore your point, I think that the solution always is to insist on the historical materialism of science, right? So not just insist on the materialism, but the historical materialism of the science, to say, not to cede ground that there is no science, or all science is bullshit, but really insist on understanding how science has evolved to come to be the way it is, and how we need to shape it differently. So I'm glad that that question came from the audience, because before, I think there's one more question on the language of war and fighting, which if you want to get to, you can answer that. But I also had another question, which is perhaps similar. So let's do them together. Is that I wanted to ask you about the implications of the book in both political ways that you've already answered, but also in emotional, kind of more personal ways. Because as you said, all of us have been touched by cancer, right? And if you know the reality of personalized medicine and genetic, the limitations of genetic theories of science, it's hard in some ways to still, trust in medicine. Or if you're, I'm sure you've had a similar experience where your friend or your family members going through cancer have reached out for advice, and sometimes you feel at a loss for how to deal with that. So in that sense, how have you perhaps dealt with that kind of that emotional toll that this stuff takes? And I guess also the language on war and fighting that the audience member has asked.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, man, it's kind of hard, because I in my mind I'm like thinking like, okay, these are like so intertwined, right? Like, but I will say is, let's okay. So here's what I will say is that, um, there's a pretty simple line that I use in the book is like, um, war causes cancer, right? There is like lots of data out there that like ammunitions or like, I mean, obviously the biggest data is from Japan with the atomic bomb radiation, right? That caused, thousands of cancer cases, but also just like routine nuclear testings cause cancer. The unexploded ammunitions cause cancer, not just in like the populations that are being terrorized, but also like the people who handle them, right? Like the service people, I mean, the veterans of the army, the veterans, they return with higher rates of cancer. And one of the big drivers of like Department of Defense funding for cancer research comes from those advocacy by veterans who have had higher rates of cancer, right? The other thing is that like cancer is not without its war, right? Like the first generation of chemotherapy, like chemicals to treat cancer, comes from World War I, like the chemical weapons that were used in the trenches, right? And they used a liquid version of like nitrogen mustard, which is a deadly gas that was used in World War I to treat leukemia, and that was the first chemotherapy experiment, right? In some ways, and I think you can't really get out of it because the narrative has been that cancer is this like enemy that's hiding within ourselves, right? And it's like going to show up at any point, like secret sleeping agents, like from the high paranoia of communism, right? Like or the Cold War, that just like is like waiting to be reactivated, and then suddenly you have to flood your body to like get rid of it as much as you can, or undergo like extensive surgeries, like which is what Halstead did with like radical mastectomies. Is that he just kept on digging with his scalpel, like he just kept on shaving off tissue for on women who were unable to have any say in the process, right? Because it's this idea that's taken root in our heads, is like you have to get rid of it in any way you can at great cost to yourself, and not just to yourself, like to your family, because this is why we're talking about finances, right? Like how expensive treatments are. And if you look at some of the studies that I code, it's like not just the person who has cancer, but also the person's family who has to pay for it, right? And I think this is where the personal stuff comes in, because my aunt, um my father's sister, she lived with us, and she she was unmarried, she didn't have our children, and so my brother and I were, and our cousins were basically her adopted kids, and we grew up with her. And she was diagnosed when I was in high school. She was diagnosed with ovarian cancer that later metastasized to her stomach, and she passed away after 2 years of struggle, right? And I saw the transformation that happened to this person, not just physically, but also like emotionally, and like it was so the chemotherapy had such a destructive effect on her. Like it left a shell of a person that I had known, so full of life, just like drained of it all, and I was sort of like struck by like this radical transformation. And I think like for a lot of people, people do realize that it's like, what is this treatment doing to me or my loved one, right? But we are told like this is how you survive, like what doesn't kill us will make us, will allow us to survive, right? And I think that sort of logic has been sort of embedded in chemotherapy research for a long time, and from the get-go, because when you read about the early trials, even for childhood leukemia, the idea was like, okay, let's just like put in all the drugs we can and see like how many of them survive, because we have to survive at all cost, right? And the reason I think, that sort of logic is at play is because we are not comfortable with the idea of death, right? And I think that's like, that's not necessarily because everybody wants to live forever. I think it's also because like we are unable to live a good life, like a fulfilling life under capitalism. And this is where the indignities of dying under capitalism becomes so real. Is like, have I been able to provide for my family? Am I leaving them in safe hands? Like, if you know what have I done with my life, right? And like when you look at like how people are living today under capitalism, like the grind that we're all going through, is like at the end of the day, would you be okay with transitioning to the whatever is next, knowing how bad things are, right? Like, and your loved ones, what they might be facing, right? And I think that's the alienation that I write about at the end of the book, is like, um where that difficult relationship is, it makes it really, reinforces the idea that we must fight, like we must fight to the end. And there are examples of people who have actively refused cancer treatment because they're at the end of their lives, and they're like, you know what, don't care anymore. Like I just want to not suffer or put myself through such misery, because at the end of the day, when you put yourself um through such a chemotherapy regimen that like leaves you a shell of your former self, it's the question is like, what is, after we have waged war on ourselves, like what is going to remain of us afterwards, right? And I think that's something we have to ask ourselves, and and be able to like talk about it, because when you go to the doctor, you can't really talk about it, right? Your doctor's not going to give you an option, and they're going to be like, if you don't take the drugs or the chemotherapy or the surgery, it's like, what do you mean you're not going to do this, and I think that's something we have to be more open about, right? um I will say, I wrote this book personally. This book has been a selfish refuge, uh because when I was writing this, the genocide in Palestine was in full swing. Not that it has stopped, right? Because it was researched again, but there was no ceasefire in sight, and in some ways I had to like sort of close off this horrors on my screen by like diving into the book, where I found fresh horrors, right? So it's just like it was but it was a refuge of some sort, because I felt like I had to write about it. And I think, at some point during writing, um I recently, I saw the news that the last cancer hospital in Gaza had been closed, and it was like a very um I had to take a break after that, after reading that, because it was just like too much. It was too much, like not to see what was playing out in front of me, and like to be able to be writing these things, right? Like in an abstract way. But yeah, so it never really leaves you, right? And I don't think in this world you can alienate yourself from like, or like, I mean, if you are a person of conscience, it's really hard to say like, oh, I'm not gonna care about this unfolding genocide, right? Like, and just like do my thing and like write about war and cancer in an abstract way. And I don't think you can do that. Or personally, I couldn't do that. Um, yeah, that's
Yeah.
I guess so.
It is
Yeah.
true. And I think to echo your point, I think cancer and perhaps in some ways, autoimmune diseases, they're the kind of manifestation of alienation even from our own bodies in a very different way from how other diseases demand. So like how much of your own body is fighting you, and how much do you alienate yourself from it, or how much are you willing to kill it? And it is a question that these diseases particularly force you to ask. So they are exceptionally devastating. But thank you for sharing the kind of the mental space you were when you were writing this book. We have one last question. Are you still involved with Science for the People? And what is new on that front from an audience member? So do you want to take that, Nafis?
Sure. I'm not actively involved. I think the last thing I did was I was an editor for the special issue called Organize the Lab, which talks about how STEM grad students are organizing in different institutions. And that's also an issue that I relied heavily on, that gave me a lot of hope, because it was very cool to read all these stuff that was happening across grad student unions. um, I do know that Science for the People is an active organization. They have a very active Discord, which is where a lot of the conversations are happening. Um, and they're also working on the magazine. The magazine comes out quarterly, I believe. And you should definitely check it out. I believe the links are in the comments, or um, yeah, or you could also just look at Science for the People. And I think similarly to what I had said about, stand up for science versus like how scientists are mobilizing, Science for the People has, or my analysis is very much derived from how Science for the People have been thinking about these things for decades, right? So I think it's worth looking into. Um, as for like other arenas where non-scientists get involved, I think the best way to get involved is do something collectively, right? Like, so join DSA, or like form a union at your workplace, right? If there's, or join your union and get activated in your union, because unions are vehicles for collective action, but they're not always where you need them to be. So you have to sort of organize your own union to do the things that you want them to do, right? So, but they are a space for collective action, right? um yeah, that's where I'm at.
Yeah, or read Nafis's book and look at the Horizons chapter for political struggles that you can participate in.
Thank
But
you. Yeah.
thank you, Nafis, for engaging in such a frank conversation. It was a
Thank
joy to
you.
talk to you. We could go on. There were other questions, but I will spare. And thank you to Haymarket Books and also to Science for the People, Common Notions Press, and Jamhoor for co-sponsoring our event. And thank you, everyone, for joining. This was a great session to have. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Tayyaba. This was such a great conversation. And thanks to everybody who tuned in. I really appreciate you coming here on a Thursday evening to listen to me blab. But thanks again to Haymarket Books. Really appreciated the opportunity. Thanks to my people at Jamhoor, Science for the People, and of course, Common Notions Press for helping me bring my ideas to the world. Thanks all.